We negate. Our sole contention is condemning the guardianship system. For decades, Saudi Arabian women received inferior rights with a lack of support from the government. As the Human Rights Watch in 2019 finds that under the male guardianship system, a man controls a Saudi woman's life from birth until her death. The Saudi state essentially treats women as permanent legal minors. Saudi Arabia has done very little to end the system, which remains the most significant impediment to women's rights in the country. However, women can now participate in society due to the weakening of the guardianship system. As Hubbard in 2019 writes that the new regulations were the most significant weakening of Saudi Arabia's guardianship system, a long-standing tangle of laws, regulations, and social customs that subjected many women's rights to the whims of their male relatives. These changes in society can be attributed to U.S. military presence in three ways. The first is Vision 2030. U.S. presence is essential to carrying out a relationship with Saudi Arabia. As Saab in 2018 writes that U.S. military departure from Bahrain would send shockwaves across the region. If the U.S. pulls out of Bahrain, expect the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia to rapidly deteriorate and possibly change forever. And the Saudis see the U.S. military presence there as an integral part of their security. This relationship is needed to uphold Vision 2030. As Tabante writes in 2018 that Saudi Arabia has become more reliant on the United States. Vision 2030, an ambitious program of social and economic reforms, in order to succeed, will require continued U.S. support. Crucially, this Vision 2030 is essential in achieving equality for women, as the World Bank in 2020 finds that Saudi women are expected to play a vital role in Vision 2030. With the kingdom recently enacting new reforms towards improving female empowerment and gender equality. The measures introduce freedom of travel and movement for women. The decrease removed restrictions on women's ability to leave the house and equalize women's rights to choose a place of residency. 5.5 million Saudi women are already benefiting from the reforms and will continue to reap the benefits for generations to come. Second is enacting legislative change and reforms. Maintaining a strong U.S.-Saudi relationship is key to influencing them to create reforms. As Sadaka in 2018 writes that Trump has established strong and trusting relations with the Crown Prince and are well positioned to articulate a both commitment to the U.S.-Saudi relationship and the importance of reform to make the case that the country's stability and reform goals are not mutually exclusive with political change. A wide array of reforms are needed. The U.S. has already passed legislation towards the advancement of women's rights in the country, as the U.S. House of Representatives in 2019 writes that the House of Representatives first reaffirms that promoting human rights and democracy has long been a bedrock of U.S. foreign policy, including advancing the rights of empowerment of women and girls. Second, condemns Saudi Arabia's continued attention and alleged abuse of women's rights advocates. Next, urges governments of Saudi Arabia officials to end the male guardianship system that restricts the ability of Saudi women to make decisions about their lives. And lastly, prioritizes women's rights as a key component of the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. Third, paving the way for modernization. The U.S. presence allows for modernization in the country, as Whitten in 2018 writes that by keeping a working relationship with Saudi Arabia, we can retain influence and urge the country down its own path of reform. This process has recently manifested itself in headline-catching moves such as finally letting women drive. The Saudi government has promised Trump to change this activity. This is why U.S. troops promote modernization that grants women's rights. As Maslin in 2020 writes that the return of U.S. troops suggests Saudi leadership is confident. Crown Prince has also sought to introduce social change like granting women the right to drive, all in an attempt to change cultural norms and project a more modern image of his country. Saudi citizens support the return of U.S. soldiers. It makes Saudi Arabia safer. Modernization has worked towards granting women more rights politically. As Perper in 2019 writes that women could vote for the first time ever in municipal elections, and women can now access basic rights like education and healthcare without permission from a male guardian. By giving women these rights, gender violence is prevented because it gives women the voice to tell their stories. As Tonneson writes, they implicitly focus on domestic violence through the campaign against the male guardianship system. The prioritization of these women is vital. Violence should be understood as a continuum that functions against all women. This sexual terrorism has become the norm where women's bodies are the battlefield. Prioritize these forms of violence because social biases underrepresent them and their effects are exponential. As Wright explains that we are socialized to think of wars as groups of men fighting, but there's actually a war on women right now.
Okay, is everyone good for your case? Okay.
Oh.
Cam, do you need to call anything or are you good?
Yeah, I need to call stuff. Could we see the link evidence for like troops leading to Vision 2030 ending, and then any link evidence on the second one too? I think you're muted.
I'm just telling her to send them.
Oh, my bad. Okay.
Wait, which ones did you want? You want the link on the first?
Just any link evidence on both sides. Both warrants.
First and second warrant.
Do you not need the third link for the third warrant?
Oh, yeah, the third warrant too. I misflipped.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Okay, you should have gotten it now.
I haven't gotten it yet. Okay, there we go. Okay, I'm good. You're muted.
You can read case.
Oh, I can read case. All right. Is everyone ready? We affirm contention 1 is preventing conflict. Vaughn of the Hill writes that following the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, Iran sensed an existential threat. For all intents and purposes, Iran was surrounded. As a result, ICG writes that Iran had sought to compensate for its sense of encirclement by achieving military capabilities against what it perceived as a US hegemony in the region. As long as the US remains in the region, Iran will continue to lash out. This is why Snow 19 writes that US military presence has resulted in tit-for-tat militarization, pushing these two foes closer to the brink of war. To make things worse, Ward of Vox continues that because there is no direct channels between the nations, the situation could easily spiral out of control due to miscalculation by either side. This is why Davis of Huffington Post ultimately concludes that if we fail to withdraw our troops, the chances are considerable that we will get drawn into a full-scale war. Friedman of The Atlantic outlines the consequences of such a disaster, indicating that Tehran will greenlight an all-out conflict by Shiite militias against an array of civilian, economic, and military targets in the region. Indeed, Fisher of New York Times continues that the proxy fights would play out across the Middle East, putting millions at risk. But even in the slight chance that a miscalculation does not occur, the escalating tensions are a recipe for disaster. Damon of NPR writes that due to the escalating tensions, fear of Iraq turning into a battleground is widespread, continuing that the U.S. troop withdrawal is viewed as the only way to protect Iraqi soil. Kadim of the Atlantic Council elaborates that concluding that due to pressure from protesters, armed militias, key political leaders, and Iraqi blockades, the U.S. troops will be forced out of the region by 2021. Critically, Jihad of WOR clarifies that there will be a huge difference between Iraq expelling the United States troops and the United States willingly withdrawing from Iraq. This is because if Iraq forces the United States out, Al-Mari of PBS writes that Trump will impose sanctions on Iraq like they've never seen before. Indeed, Heeb of Business Insider continues that the administration has already started drafting the sanctions. The result of such a policy would be devastating. As Quilly of CDN writes that the last time the United States imposed sanctions, they are estimated to have killed around 1.6 million Iraqis, elaborating that the new sanctions would likely be even worse. Our second contention is Yemen. Yemen is the site of the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, with the nation embroiled in a war between the Houthi rebels and the US-backed Saudi coalition. The conflict has destroyed infrastructure and prevented adequate resources from entering the nation. Critically, Summers of The Guardian reports that if the war continues, famine could engulf the country with 13 million civilians at risk of starvation. Withdrawing the US presence ends the war for two reasons. First is through ending the security guarantee. Clark of National Interest writes that Saudi's regime's reckless behavior in Yemen is embedded by this implicit security guarantee from American troops, as the regime can afford to be obstinate when it has the protection of the United States. Indeed, Bazi of The Atlantic notes that Saudi Arabia is more likely to accept a peace process if the US won't provide military assistance required to keep the war apparatus going. Second is eliminating Saudi's capabilities. Christoph of the New York Times indicates that the Saudi military is dependent on American spare parts, logistics, and munitions. Acton 18 contextualizes this, writing that without support, they would doubtlessly find it more difficult to wage the war in Yemen. These two factors have come close to ending the conflict in the past. As Parsi of Foreign Policy reports, Trump has refused to retaliate against Iran. Or after Trump refused to retaliate against Iran, Saudi Arabia recognized the United States military was no longer at their disposal and began exercising their diplomatic options, resulting in an 80% reduction in airstrikes. However, Parsi notes that by returning to the region in a show of military force, Trump de-incentivized diplomacy, and our allies interpreted the Soleimani killings as a license to resume their reckless activities. Thus we affirm. You guys good for cross, or do you need to
I'm good. I don't need to see anything.
Okay, hold on, let me set up my timer. Okay, could I get first question? So let's talk about this idea that like US troops will be forced out by 2021, and by that time Trump would instead like impose sanctions on Iraq, right? What's the warrant?
It's like
what?
When we get forced out, we impose sanctions.
Right. So what's the warranting as to why he would put these sanctions on Iraq?
Because the United States doesn't like to look weak. We like to have a good military presence in places. And so when we get forced out, Trump perceptually wants to put in sanctions. He's drafting them.
The actual warranting of all of the literature on that all says that the reason as to why he would put sanctions on Iraq is because he wants to make them repay for all the money he put into bases in the country, right? So wouldn't that happen in either world? Because if we pulled out right now, wouldn't he still have to put sanctions on them in order to?
No, because the international community would absolutely not accept that. See, he needs a reason to
Wait, if the international community won't accept that, then why would they do it by 2021?
Well, no, if we get forced out of a place, then Trump has a viable reason to put in sanctions. He has a way to say this is what they're doing. This is why we need to put in sanctions. If he withdraws himself and then says, oh, we left, now we might as well impose sanctions on them, that's not going to work.
But the warranting on all the literature is that it's because about the money of bases and making them repay for all the money he would be losing from pulling out of the country.
I think we might be talking about two different kinds of sanctions. We're talking about essentially a total embargo on Iraqi trade.
Right, to make them repay, all the evidence says to make them repay for all the money they've spent in billions on these bases in those countries.
The sanctions that are being currently used to have them repay are sanctions on things like their purchases of Iranian oil, very small sanctions that don't have nearly the same effect. Can I get a question?
Yeah.
Okay. So why are US troops 100% necessary for all three of your warrants?
Right. So firstly, for Vision 23, it's the Saab and the Tabansi evidence, which says that the reason as to why, the only way as to how Vision 2030 can succeed is if they have US support and US presence in the country, because they promote things like modernization and because they advocate for women's rights in the country, which goes into the other two links too, because what the modernization link talks about is how, because it's the Wooden evidence that says that the US presents this idea of modernization makes the country more modern.
Got you. So is it the troops themselves that are promoting this? Is it the people on the ground that are promoting this?
Right. So it's two things, right? One is the troops, because it prevents people from doing bad things in those countries to the same extent because they're physically on ground. But it's also just the idea that we're there supporting them, we have a relationship with them, and so we promote these things in the country.
So part of it is that the US troops on the ground are policing the actions that are going on in Saudi Arabia. But then why do we actually have to be in the region to say to condemn these actions? Because
that, okay, so that's the Saab evidence, which explains that we wouldn't have a relationship with them if we pulled out of the country. That's time.
Your case is contingent on us just entirely getting rid of our relationship with Saudi Arabia.
I mean, not entirely, but to somewhat of an extent when putting out troops.
Okay. I'm gonna run chat starting now. Okay, that was a minute of time. Is everyone ready? I'm gonna start at an overview on my case and then move to theirs. Okay. In today's round, you must refer gender violence impacts over the affirmative team's impacts because the violent women's rights are consistently marginalized as the OHCHR finds that as a judge, it should be a moral obligation to reject gender-based violence in the status quo. They write, preventing and addressing gender-based violence against women is not a charitable act, but a legal and moral obligation requiring legislative reforms and the eradication of gender stereotypes which perpetuate gender-based violence. This means that it's your moral obligation to vote negative because U.S. military presence helps women by forcing Saudi Arabia to remove oppressive laws. We are the only team that discusses women's rights, and we say that they must be prioritized over anything else. Extend our array evidence at the bottom of the case that indicates that prioritizing women is paramount. As women ignore how women are disproportionately affected, we allow structural violence to become more of a societal norm. Now let's go to their first contention about Iranian conflict. First, you can turn it because U.S. removal spurs arms race and nuclear proliferation. Even if a confrontation were to happen, Hotterall in 19 finds that U.S. presence helps to contain the effects. As without the U.S., there would be a regional arms race of conventional force and then intensified to create nuclear arms. That's extremely problematic because U.S. presence reduces the risk of a military confrontation by preventing regional instability. But secondly, Khalilaz in 19 finds that even if the actual U.S. hegemony was bad, if the U.S. were to pull out of the region and cause a shift away from U.S. hegemony and embolden Iran to spread into other regions, that's extremely worse because it's going to cause more hostile environments and more authoritarianism. But third, you can turn it again because after the U.S. removed their troops from Syria, there were days of violence where civilians were displaced. It's covered in 19 finds that the abrupt order by Mr. Trump to remove U.S. military personnel from Syria caused days of violence that caused 150,000 civilians to become displaced in one day. This would be just in other countries as well. But then fourth, they talk about sanctions. It's not going to happen in two reasons. The first is that it's non-unique because the U.S. has sanctions on countries such as Iran and Iraq for decades now. But secondly, the only actor who's talked about it is Trump. The House would have no incentive to do this. But then on to the impact level of war. First, TOC in 2020 finds that coronavirus slashes military budgets. This means that in the near future, no war can actually happen because coronavirus diverts funds away from military budgets, rather into other areas. But secondly, you can turn it because coronavirus has brought about a global ceasefire that has resulted in a push to come to the negotiating table. This is UN in 2020 who finds that 70 member states of the UN have already endorsed this plan. But third, we would argue that they've been in the region for a while. We've never seen a war actually materialize, but we see a war on women right now. But then let's go into the second tension about Yemen. First, it's non-unique, as there will always be a war, as Aziz in 19 finds, that even if the Saudi-led coalition were to pull out, the Houthis would still fight to go and spread in the region. But secondly, there's no link because the U.S. has passed a resolution to end its military assistance in Yemen, as The Guardian in 19 finds that Congress has given the final approval where the Senate passed a resolution last month that would stop the involvement in the long-running Yemen conflict. But third, there's no link because the U.S. has no presence in Yemen, cutting off Saudi Arabia to help the civilians as post-19 finds that the U.S. currently extends only limited support in intelligence training. There are no troops in that region, and they've already stopped aerial refueling. This argument is simply outdated. But then fourth, just a week ago, there's been a global ceasefire that has led to the conflict to end, as Saudi Arabia has agreed to pay $500 million towards aid efforts in Yemen. But onto these two links about a guarantee and ammunition. The problem is, without the U.S. in this region, it would just cause Russia and China to fill in. As McLaren in 2020 finds that the Russians and the Chinese are maneuvering for advantage. There's no question that the Middle East is the epicenter for global competition. So if the U.S. interests were to pull out, they would fill in. This means the conflict would always happen. But Crossy 19 finds that U.S. presence in the Middle East is key to keeping hegemony and keeping order in the region. However, a lack of U.S. hegemony would destabilize the region, causing further conflict and further harming civilians. There is no solvency. The only solvency is with U.S. presence.
We're going to take some prep. we're pausing prep really quickly. Could we see the 150K Syria evidence? Okay, resuming prep. Well, actually, we'll wait for it.
You guys should have gotten it.
Yeah, I think we just got it. Thank you. Okay, resuming prep now.
Okay, I'm good. It's just going to be, oh, wait, let me mute my,
How much did you guys use to prep?
2.5 minutes. It's just going to be our case and then their case. Everyone good?
Wait, I'm sorry. Give me 1 second. My AirPods just ran out of battery, so let me disconnect.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. Everyone good? Okay, great. Time starts now. Let's start at the top of our case on our first warrant about conflict, on our first contention. They say that without the US, there would be an arms race that led to nuclear arms being proliferated. We're going to prerequisite this turn. The US has encouraged our allies to be more aggressive in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Should the Arab nations become less aggressive, they'd also spend less on militaries. That would solve back. And then second, the uniqueness on this argument says that the only reason that Iran expands and forces other nations to increase the amount of arms that they use is because they feel encircled by the US in the first place. If the US was to leave the region, there's no incentive for Iran to expand. Their goal is to become a regional hegemon. It's very hard to do that by destabilizing the entire region. It's only because they see the Western presence as a block to them becoming a regional hegemon that they use violence. Once the US goes away, there's no necessity to do that. They reach out through diplomacy. We've seen that in the past. That also takes care of their response that Iran's going to expand and take control of regions if the US leaves. They wouldn't do that. Then they read the Syria turn. But there's no clear warrant that's extended here. But I'd also say that it's outweighed by an Iraqi war that literally destabilizes the entire Middle East. So even if you buy it, we outweigh it. But they don't actually touch the link into war. What we say is that right now in the status quo, tensions are really, really high. We're on the brink of war. But if the only reason that's true is because Iran feels encircled by the US. If the US were to leave, the potential for miscalculation that exists in the status quo goes away. That prevents a massive war in the Middle East. That's a very big impact in this round. The second one is on sanctions. They make two responses. First, they say we've had sanctions on Iran and Iraq for a long time now. But first, these sanctions are only individual. We've had sanctions on Iran that are larger, but what Trump is proposing is putting sanctions on Iraq that rival these. Why? Because he's already invested a lot of money in Iraq. If he were to leave willingly, which the affirmative world does, he just pulls out, then he has no justification to impose sanctions. But if Iraq makes him lose that investment by forcing him out, that's when he can impose sanctions. And they say that there's no necessity to do this. But first, it allows Trump to help his base rally around the idea that he's tough on foreign nations. But it also, proposals have already been written. Congress is planning to pass it. I'm also pretty sure Trump can just do it through an executive order, we're going to concede the dealings on the second contention and kick out of it. But let's go on to their case. We're going to weigh our case over their case because we'd say our case is a prerequisite for two reasons. First, in Saudi Arabia specifically, the U.S. cannot hedge against the Saudis, and the Saudis will not be forced to reform in a world with a war, because the war is going to take a much larger picture in the U.S. eye compared to Saudi reform. The U.S. would always focus on the war first. The second reason is that the war itself would lead to more abuse and violence against women in general, because it prevents institutional reforms in any country, and that outweighs on scope because we're impacting out to every single country in the Middle East, because the war would spread out among all the countries. Let's talk about their warrant specifically. Their first warrant is about Vision 2030, but their evidence is not about the U.S. specifically. It's just about U.S. presence, both militarily and politically. They never proved that U.S. troops leaving the region would meet the bright line of this presence going away. Their evidence is very nebulous here. I'd say stuff like arms sales and political ties could still serve the same purpose. The second warrant is about leverage, but I'd say leverage exists either way, kind of the same thing as before. There's 4 reasons I could give you: World Bank loans, IMF loans, business interests, arms sales, U.S. intelligence, in the war effort. If we prove that this leverage always exists in either world, it means the argument is non-unique, because the U.S. is always able to hedge against Saudi Arabia. But I'd say that the one scenario in which this wouldn't be possible is one in which there is a war going on and the U.S. isn't able to do that. Their last warrant is about U.S. troops leaving, but even when they left in the past, nothing happened. That's time.
Are you ready for call?
Yeah.
Okay. So at the top of my case, to my overview, you tell me that war is a prerequisite, right? Is there a war right now?
No.
But there's a war on women right now, right?
Yeah.
So shouldn't we solve for that war first before we actually get into any other nebulous war in the future?
So what we're saying is that because the probability of war is so likely in the status quo, it means...
Okay, but that doesn't take out the fact that there is a war on women right now, and your train of logic as to why we should value war over other scenarios is the reason why women's violence is not talked about and put at the back burner of discussion and become a societal norm.
So our logic is right now there's progress being made, but if we allow a very probable war to break out, then it would destroy any progress in the long term. So that's a risk that we should...
So what happened in Somalia in 2011?
I'm not
when
sure.
There was a war going on. We sent in peacekeepers. We sent in diplomats. And what that did is nonprofit organizations help solve women's rights, as wars do not mean women's rights are put at the back burner. Instead, it means the complete opposite.
Okay, wait, could you say that again?
When we go into wars, there's an amount of NGOs and nonprofit organizations that are in the region. Those are crucial because they help women's violence and allow them to leave abusive relationships.
Okay.
And that happens only during wartime.
Yeah, I will call for the evidence, but I'd also say that we wouldn't be able to send NGOs to nations that we're fighting with, like hostile nations, which brings up the scope analysis that I read in rebuttal, which is if the Middle East is destabilized, we can send NGOs everywhere.
Do you have a question?
Yeah. So why are military troops the unique form of leverage we need to force Saudi Arabia to do things?
So it's basically the analogy of a policeman. When we have a police in the region, or if a police is driving by us, we're going to slow down. It's the same idea that we don't want to look bad in the image. So if troops are stationed around the nation, they're not going to be committing the same amount of abuses, which is why Molson finds that we've seen an increase in rights when troops have been in the region, which is why recently when we've intersected back in the region, women were given the chance to vote and women were given these opportunities that they never were able to do. And now they can report gendered violence against them.
So do the women report to the troops?
So it's the idea that in Sharia law, this guardianship system, 4 men have to be watching this domestic violence happen for it to actually be seen as legitimate. However, in recent times, this law has gone away. So it means that women can go to the police station and not have to worry about what's going to happen. So it's either you're going to U.S. troops or you're going to other police in the region.
You have evidence saying they're going specifically to U.S. troops to report like domestic.
No, it's just the idea that U.S. troops equal modernization, which helps solve domestic violence and gender violence towards women.
So isn't MBS like trying to modernize anyway, just to like keep up with the U.S. and strengthen his alliance with the U.S.?
Yeah, but he has international pressure from the U.S. because the troops are in the region, and that's fine.
Okay.
We're gonna take prep.
Yeah, we're gonna run some prep.
Starting.
Okay.
That was 1:15, so we have 45 seconds left.
So, hold on. It's gonna start on our overview, our case, their case. Okay, is anyone not ready? Okay, perfect. Remember that gender violence is the single most important impact in the round, as each instance of war that they isolate is just exacerbated by gender violence, which is why you should prefer gender violence impacts over potential war scenarios, because right at the bottom of our case indicates that we see war on women in the status quo. We are taught to think of wars as groups of men fighting, however, fail to realize the possibility of war in a different sense. The OHCHR evidence, PM Reader rebuttal, says we have a moral obligation as a judge to prioritize discussion of gender violence, because otherwise you only allow it to become a societal norm. Allowing it to become a societal norm means women are unable to discuss their stories and make reform for the future. Even if they claim to link in or solve, Rice says that it doesn't matter, because it's also your obligation as a judge to rhetorically endorse gender violence happening. That only happens when you vote neg. It's the only way you gain even a risk of solvency into stopping the war on women. But now, on our case where we access this. First, you're voting on Vision 23. As Saab explains, that a U.S. pullout means our relationship with Saudi Arabia would actually deteriorate. This responds to their one response on our case, which says that the evidence is not about U.S. military, it's about U.S. military and political relationship. But the Saab evidence responds to this really well by saying that the relationship would completely go away if we pull out. As Tabanti explains, that Saudi Arabia is more reliant on the U.S. now, and the relationship is needed to uphold Vision 2030. The World Bank is really good at saying that Vision 2030 is essential for enacting reforms for female empowerment and gender equality. These women are now able to leave their homes, they're able to drive, they are able to own their own homes by themselves. We've already seen 5.5 million women benefiting from Vision 2030. But then the second reason you can vote for us is on our third link about modernization, which goes untouched. The Witten evidence explains that the president encourages modernization in Saudi Arabia, and the government promises Trump to make change. And Malson explains that Saudi Arabia government is attempting to change the cultural norms now and social change for women and project more of a modern image of the country. This is all really important because modernization increases women's political rights and increases their ability to speak out against abuses that occur to them or anything along that lines, and it allows for more modernization in the country, which grants women more rights. And Wright explains that you must prioritize that first, because if not, you allow the war on women to become a societal norm. On the overview, they respond two ways. They say there are prerequisites, because first, Saudis can't reform when there's a war, and second, that war would lead to more abuse. Firstly, we would argue there's never going to be a war. I'll get to that on their case. But secondly, I would argue that there's a war on women right now. Prioritize for this first over this nebulous potential war that they talk about. On their case where they think they access war. On the turn about U.S. removal spurring arms race, they say they're a prerequisite because people become more aggressive and their goal is to be a regional hegemon, but like you're never going to see people spring an arms race. It's about a bunch of countries, like a power vacuum, and a bunch of countries trying to like increase their arms because they want to, and that would create an arms race. Then the powerhouse evidence explains that you embolden other countries to spread into other regions. They just said this wouldn't happen. They give no warranting. Then Hubbard explains in Syria, when we pulled out, there's 150,000 people displaced. They say there's no warrant. We would argue it's a security that when you pull out the country, the transition is really harmful for the people and it displaces them. That outweighs a war. But then you can also extend the Corona answers as to why this war would never happen. First, because Corona slashes budgets, and second, because Corona increased negotiations. This war is never actually going to happen in their war. Prioritize the war happening now.
Okay, we're going to take our 30 seconds, starting. Just kidding, I forgot to start the timer. Hold on 1 second. All right, starting now.
Time. Have you guys done?
We're good. Okay. Is everyone ready? Everyone good? Okay. It's going to be overview, their case, our case. Actually, overview, yeah, overview, their case, our case. Started with the overview. They tell you that like prioritizing gender violence is going to be the most important thing. We can agree to this, but the one thing we disagree on is that even if we link in, we should still win the round because we link in better. That's really critical. The only warranting here they say is because there's a war on women right now that we should be focusing on that. But by doing that, you risk it getting like infinitely worse. Just because it's happening right now, it doesn't mean that we should be focusing on it 100%. Instead, we should be focusing on preventing it from getting infinitely worse. If we prove that it gets worse, then we win the round. That's really critical. Look to their case first. Remember what they're warranting that they give you on our second contention that says that other countries are simply going to fill in. This takes out their entire case because if other countries are going to fill in and help Saudi Arabia, then Saudi Arabia no longer has the like incentive to stop creating these reforms. Because when other countries fill in, it just creates a security guarantee that they say allows for like women to get better rights and things like that. If there's going to be fill in, then their entire case is non-unique because you're still going to see the reforms happening. But even if that doesn't happen, all three of their warrants are kind of silly here. First, they only say that the only link into their actual like betterment of these people's lives is if the United States entirely ends their relations with Saudi Arabia. They don't give you a single warrant as to why we'd be ending our relations with Saudi Arabia. They just give you one piece of evidence with no warranting. We give you 4 warrants as to why our relationship stays and why we're why we're going to continue to be able to exert our pressure on Saudi Arabia to continue making reforms. First, IMF loans are really, really critical for Saudi Arabia and a lot of other countries in the region. Second, World Bank loans, also really critical. Third, the remote intel for Saudi Arabia. Fourth, aid that goes to Saudi Arabia. All 4 of these continue to have our relationship with Saudi Arabia. Their only link into any of their impacts is if we entirely get rid of the United States-Saudi relations. Insofar as that doesn't happen, we continue to exert pressure. You don't see anything happening in the app world with this. In fact, we're going to argue that it gets a lot worse in the lot worse in the neg world. Then go on to our case. First, look to our first contention where we talk about conflict and sanctions. The only things that they extend are first the prerequisite says the United States is like let me just start at that. Look to our case on our first contention about conflict. They say that like there's going to be an arms race. We tell you that the United States creates these arms races by encouraging violence in a lot of these countries. That goes unresponded to. We frontline this turn. And then secondly, they say that Iran would just like be emboldened to go into other places. We tell you that this is only because of U.S. encroachment on the Iranian sovereignty. When the United States goes out, you actually see more peace in the region because Iran no longer feels like they need to be continually splintering these places to get rid of American hegemony. When American hegemony leaves by itself, Iran settles down. That goes unresponded to. They just ignore it. Then they bring up a couple of these things about Corona, like a war not happening, but war is currently happening in Corona. War is currently like happening. They say that themselves. There's like a lot of proxy conflicts going on right now. It's clear that these people that these countries can still spend money on it. Where you're really going to be voting for us is right here, because when you increase conflict and you destabilize the nation, you make it a lot harder for structural reforms to happen that actually help increase women's rights. That's really critical, because insofar as you decrease the ability for these things to actually, for these reforms that they say are so good to continue happening, that's a clear way to link into their framework. We're easily winning the round right there.
Are you guys ready for cross?
Could I get first question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you tell us that, like, as a general response to our entire case, that like our fill-in non-uniques it because other countries can just promote modernization.
Yeah.
First of all, is that not a new response in second summary?
You guys made the response. It's just applying it to your case.
Okay, sure. So,
so even then, right? Do countries that would fill in, like Russia and China, actually want to promote like modernization in that country?
Both countries are extremely.
I would say at the point where China detains 3 million people, like of their own people in the nation, that's clearly not a demonstration of human rights.
You guys are talking about specifically gender issues, correct?
We'd also say that like it's not necessarily Russia and China. Like countries like Britain can also fill in for military people. So
that's kind of new in Crossfire, but
Britain can fill in.
Because our warranting, which you say you cross apply, is specifically talking about Russia and China.
Okay, so if we're talking about Russia and China, both of them, so we're talking about specifically gender issues, right?
Yes.
Okay. China doesn't have an atrocious track record with gender issues. They have a much better one.
But it does have a track record.
Okay.
So does the US.
United States.
We're not perfect either.
Yeah, I agree, but I also think that we're way more progressive than any of those nations.
Yeah, I also don't think there's any warranting or evidence as to why like Russia and China would want to promote modernization in the country. But like you guys can have a question.
I can give you the warrant for that. It's that they both want to stay up with the United States, and this is the same warrant that like Saudi Arabia has. They want to modernize to keep up with the rest of the world, and in order to modernize, you need to have gender equality.
Either way, that's a new response. But sure, do you guys have a question?
All right.
Sure. So since when has Iran aggressed and like invaded other nations or funded proxies?
I would say like, yes, there have been proxy wars, but at the point where the US is containing its effects right now, and you tell me yourself that Iran wants regional hegemony, what's going to happen when the US pulls out? They get regional hegemony. That's a really bad thing.
Yeah,
that's going to cause a
you guys never
authoritarianism.
Case that says that the reason they want hegemony in the region is to push out the United States. So if the United States,
yeah, but they want to push out the U.S. right now so they can get their own regional hegemony, right? Like in a world without the U.S. The reason why they're trying to impose sanctions right now.
I mean, we're just going to keep extending the uniqueness from our case, but y'all can have a question.
Okay, so let's go on this idea of like we can keep our relations with Saudi Arabia while still pulling out. Wouldn't that non-unique all of your points about conflict, because it means that you can still have pressure over a country without physically being there?
Sure. So what the response we make in both rebuttal and summary is that if our arguments about leverage on your second warrant hold up, it gives us solvency for your case. The reason that
the second warrant, so like
no,
but we're saying that if our defense holds up on that warrant, it still gives us solvency for the rest of the arguments. But
why? Because the third one's relying specifically on truth.
Because the leverage isn't like the leverage is not mutually exclusive from the other two warrants. You can still use.
Okay, that's time. We're gonna run the rest of our 45 seconds of prep. Okay, it's going to start my case and then go to yours, starting at the overview. Is everyone ready? We are winning this round because of our overview. They tell you that they are trying to link in, but then they tell you that we shouldn't focus on it 100%. This entire mindset is why Ray tells you that the systematic abuse has occurred and why women are at the back burner of discussion right now. And the only risk we have of actually solving it is to sign your ballot and egg. This comes in two ways. The first is through Vision 2030, as all they've said is that the fill-in effect goes here because other countries are just going to fill in. The problem here is first, they give no warrant, and two, I would argue that China and Russia are extremely bad actors to be advocating for women's violence because they do not have this roles in their countries. But then what we tell you from U.S. pullout would deteriorate our relationship completely, which is crucial to uphold Vision 2030, which already in 1 year of implementing has already solved 5.5 million women have entered the workforce. In another 10 years, who knows what it's going to do. But then third, on modernization, extend Whitten, which goes unresponded to, who says that the troops, not even this leverage argument that they talk about, but the actual truth is advocating for reforms. This is what the purpose who finds that the government is trying to attempt to change the cultural norms because they feel international pressure from U.S. troops in the region. As Tonneson finds, this is crucial to take down the gender violence that occurs because women are now able to report their issues and have legal identities. But then let's go into their other response about how there's other ways to have pressure. This literally takes out their argument about preventing conflict at these points where women, there's always going to be pressure from the U.S. This means that there's always going to be some sort of Iranian aggression to get the U.S. pressure out of the region. But then onto their specific argument about conflict. Even if you want to buy this is all going to happen, look on the impact level, which goes unresponded to. The first is that coronavirus has slashed military budgets, meaning a war is not happening in the future. The problem is a war on women is happening right now. But secondly, there's been a global ceasefire and an end to violence right now. But then they just tell you that a war is happening now. That takes out their argument about a war happening in the future. But then extending term tells you that Syrian violence increased and 150,000 people were enslaved. But then secondly, because of the arms race, they just tell you that this would never spur the U.S. into doing it right now. The argument is about a power vacuum in the region, which happens when the U.S. pulls out. You are negating for all these reasons.
Is everyone ready? It's going to be the framing. It's going to be our case, the framing, and then their case. Is everyone ready? Time starts. Wait. Okay. Time starts. Now let's start on our case. They extend a couple of responses. First, they say there's always going to be some level of leverage, so it doesn't matter because they're cross-applying our response. What our argument says specifically is the U.S. military presence on the border of Iraq next to Iran is what Iran feels is encirclement. As long as that military presence exists, Iran is always going to lash out. That leads to increased tensions and miscalculation, which will spiral out into war. That war would be extremely devastating because it would spread around the region and destabilize the entire Middle East, which would displace over millions. Our evidence says it would kill millions and displace many more. That's going to outweigh the turn they read about Syria, which doesn't really have a warrant anyway. They also give a response about coronavirus, but what Ethan frontlines by saying that escalation is still extremely high in the status quo. Coronavirus isn't having that big of an impact. On the U.S. power vacuum argument, our uniqueness response to it. If the U.S. leaves Iran, Iran doesn't need to keep aggressing, and also there's no increased arms race because the reason we have arms races is because the U.S. just pushes its allies to aggress even more. If the U.S. goes away, then there's going to be more peace in the Middle East because Iran doesn't have to use proxies. There's no power vacuum. But then let's talk about the framing. They say that they win the round because there's gender violence in the quo and there's no actual war in the status quo. They don't respond to Ethan's response to that weighing. What he tells you is that because we can't just prioritize things because they're happening right now. If the status quo could become much worse and leads to those things getting worse. Our argument is that a war happening in the status quo would make these issues a lot worse, which is why you prioritize our argument. They take the attention away from institutional reforms and instead focus everything on war that prevents any of this from happening. Let's go on to the substance of their case. Our defense sums up to this. What we're saying is there's always going to be a level of U.S. leverage in the region. There's arms sales, there's IMF loans, there's aid. There's a lot of ways the U.S. can stay involved. They don't extend a single card saying troops are the ones that are necessary. We We've made the argument since rebuttal that as long as some level of leverage exists, the US can always push back and they can always fall for this.
Good round.
Okay, give me 2
Good
seconds.
round.
Good round.
Okay, I voted negative. Let's start on the affirmative flow. I'll actually start on the overview. So everyone concedes that the way in which we're going to frame the round is by who best mitigates violence against women. Obviously, the affirmative says they link into it better because they're going to stop conflict as a whole, and that might have a better link or, I guess, access to scope when it comes to violence committed against women. One, I think that you have to do a better job in terms of that overview. I think it's probably pretty intuitive that conflict increases violence against women, but I think you have to do a better job of saying, even if you're winning that, why the urgency, the immediacy that's happening in Saudi Arabia is going to be outweighed by a conflict. I'm not sure when it's going to happen. I don't know what the time frame is. I don't know what the bright line is. On the affirmative advantages, I do think that's an interesting argument they make. Look, there's a double bind on you. If you say there's external pressures that will apply to Saudi Arabia, why don't those external pressures also apply to Iran? You say no, that the only contributing factor is that Iraq has, or the U.S. has presence on the border of Iran, and that's what's causing encirclement. I don't get any bright line or time frame as to why this is going to lead to conflict. When is it going to lead to conflict? Why is this the most important factor? Even if all of this is true, I don't know how to weigh that against what the urgency is of the status quo. When is this conflict going to take place in terms of how many women is it going to affect in terms of fallout? I don't know how to do the comparative analysis. Also, coronavirus terminal defense, I thought the responses weren't great. You just say, oh no, there is conflict happening in the status quo. And then you say, like, this will continue regardless of the coronavirus. They give, I think, some pretty good warrants as to why domestic spending trade-offs are going to happen and they can't actually spend on conflict. You just say that's not true. I need to know why. And you just assert in the summary in the final focus that escalation is higher than it's ever been. I need warrants as to reasons why. Why is escalation at the highest point it's ever been? I have no reasons as to why that's the case. The only thing I get extended, I think, that is some chance of probability is that Iran feels encircled at the moment. I don't know when this conflict's going to break out. I don't know when it's going to spiral out. I don't know in terms of solving back for gender violence when is this going to play out and how the region is going to be affected. If you give me more certainty, as in you have evidence, for example, there's good evidence from this week that they're engaging in internal skirmishes in parts of Baghdad with the PMF militias. If you have evidence that they're moving troops to the western border of Iran, something like that gives me a sense of urgency. I think you just assert that this is the highest point of escalation that's ever been. I don't get any reasons as to why that's the case, and I'm not sure if you can get access to any of the impacts that you're talking about. On arms races, look, this is the chicken or egg problem, this topic. I don't think I've seen only a few practice rounds. It's kind of hard to resolve. I think teams on both sides have to do a better job of saying, hey, if U.S. aggresses first and then pulls out, does Iran aggress more or do they aggress less? And you have to give me like here are 3 ways to determine this chicken or egg problem. Historical precedents, empirics, I guess, which is also historical precedents, incentives, I don't know, something. You have to give me a way to resolve how Iran responds to it, because I think going back and forth. Historically, they've de-escalated. Historically, they've escalated. Historically, these are their incentives. Historically, those are their disincentives. I just don't think there's a likelihood of conflict. I think there's a terminal defense that takes it out. Even if Iran feels encircled by the United States, I don't know why the affirmative really solves back for that in a way that's meaningful in a conflict I'm not sure when it's going to happen or what it's going to look like. On the negative, look, I do think it's probably true that there are other points of leverage, like the affirmative points out. Maybe there's bank loans, maybe there's military aid, maybe there's some sort of political conversation that can happen. I do think NSU, from your perspective, I think it came out a little bit later in the round, probably with modernization as well as sort of the first link. But I do think you have to do like a better job of indicating: is it the number of troops in the region? Is what is it? What's why? If there's 5 points of leverage, are troops the most important? And if you can tell me the reason why, like, I can at least give you more credit as to why it's the most important piece of leverage. At the very minimum, maybe even if the affirmative is right, if Acton's right, that there's 4 other pieces of leverage. Acton, I need more reasons as to why those other pieces of leverage are capable of equal amounts of solvency. They, I think, at least extend on the modernization link, which gives me uniqueness as to why the remoteness of the troops on the ground is maybe going to give some sort of political or military leverage that otherwise wouldn't exist if they were remote or if they weren't from the United States. Obviously, this other argument that other actors can fill in, A, I think it's pretty late in the round. B, you say that China and Russia want modernization because everyone wants modernization because we're moving forward progress. I don't think that's the case. I need warrants as to the reason why. I don't think you can just assert that. Yeah, I think that at the very least, even if there's alternative forms of leverage, I think you take away one form of leverage, which risks, I think, reversing the progress that they've made within Saudi Arabia. So if the round is about minimizing urgent and on-the-ground violence against women, I think the only likely scenario where impact is happening right now is in Saudi Arabia. I have no sense of the conflict that's going to happen with Iran and Iraq. When's it going to happen? All I get is assertions that it's tensions are high and escalations can happen at any moment, and no reasons or comparisons as to why I should choose one or the other. At the very least, I think the risk of solving for gender violence flows from the negative, though I think they need to do a better job of telling you why it's the number of troops, what the troops do in terms of why is it that Saudi Arabia cares about this form of leverage more than any of the others, and how they help facilitate modernization, because I feel like they're almost kind of related. So if you can kind of resolve that vagueness, I think that would help as well. Yeah, that's how I saw the round. Are there questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, good luck, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.